Hi, thank you for joining Good Government Illinois for our very first virtual town hall. I'm Morgan Harris. I'm with the Acacia Consulting Group, which is producing the event tonight. I'm going to go over a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started with the program. First of all, if this is your first time using a Zoom conference system, I just want to go over a couple of functions. Everybody is muted except for our hosts or our guests, and that's really just to keep chatter and ambient noise down. If you look at the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you should see an icon that says Stop Video. If you don't want your video on, you can just click that and nobody can see you. In the center bottom of your screen, you're going to see a button that says Chat. And that's how you're going to ask your questions tonight. Some people have submitted questions already when they RSVP'd, and we're going to start going through those first. But if you have a question throughout the program, go ahead and click the chat and let me know what your question is, and we'll go ahead and get in queue. If we don't get to all the questions, Fritz has agreed to answer more questions over the coming week, and so we'll post those responses to anything we don't get to tonight to our Facebook page. The hashtag for tonight's virtual town hall is #GoodGovIL, and you can find our Twitter handle at @GoodGovIllinois. Now I'd like to turn it over to David Orr of Good Government Illinois.
Thank you, Morgan. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Fritz. I know it's kind of strange here since we've all been isolated, and all of a sudden we might have 150 people involved here, but we really can't socialize like we'd like. So a quick word about good government before we get to Fritz. Back in 1990, I ran for county clerk, another office that may not be the sexiest sounding office. I ran for county clerk. I'd been in the city council for nearly 12 years. And what really excited me about becoming an executive or administrative office is I wanted to prove, particularly after those years in the city council and seeing the corruption and inefficiency, I wanted to prove that you could run government efficiently. You could run progressively. You could hire good people. You could save money, efficiencies, customer service, those kinds of things. And so when I retired fairly recently, I wanted to continue this. And so with other colleagues like Fritz, we started Good Government Illinois, basically to continue our three major goals: good progressive public policy, protecting the vote, and electing good people to office who share those values. Distrust in government is a very high level right now. And particularly we can see the impact of not so good government with the federal response, of course, to COVID-19. On the other hand, we see certain places, whether it's local mayors or local governors, where they seem to make government shine a bit, show how he can help people. So one of the things we do, I'm not going to go into much details, we hold these forums. Some of you may know we had one in mind for a couple of weeks from now, where we had 3 aldermen scheduled to talk about progressive policies in the city council: Scott Wagesback, Sue Garza-Sedlowski, and Matt Martin. So we postponed that one, but in about 2 weeks, we're going to do a similar thing with Scott Wagesback and talk particularly about the budget and the finances, given, of course, this amazing impact of the pandemic. So let me just move on now, and we're ready to deal with Fritz here. One of the reasons that I want to invite Fritz on, one, is because his office is so important. The assessor's office is really critical, and particularly after we saw how much it was messed up by the past assessor, and the scandals uncovered by ProPublica and the Tribune, in which so many people's assessments were poorly done, resulting in them paying more than they should, while the fat cats got away with paying less than they should. Second issue is politically. It's very important. Fritz Kaegi, in this case, Fritz's election, to elect a progressive to that very powerful office that formerly was held by the chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party. And he was not a newcomer. He was kind of an old machine style person. So I think it had a lot to do with a change in a number of things, helping us elect more good progressives in 2019, and hopefully that bodes well for the future. So bear in mind, the assessor in this county and assessor's office may not be the most glamorous office. We'll do our best to answer your questions. We probably have far more than we can get to. But let's get right into it. I'm going to ask us a few questions of Fritz, and then we're going to go right to a lot of the questions that people have already sent them in.
Sure. And David, before we get to the questions, I just wanted to thank everyone for taking their time. On an evening like this, we have so many familiar friends and new faces here. I really appreciate you taking time to learn about this, and we'll try our best to answer all your questions. So thank you for being here.
Good. Let's start with an introductory one. Okay. Given that you're kind of new there, tell us some of the problems, not in great detail, but what you faced. Some of the key problems you faced in taking over that office, and what you did about them, and how that affects average people in terms of other lives and what you did.
Well, I think a parable kind of captures a lot of this. So when we came into office first week of December in 2018, on the 9th floor of City Hall, where our analysts sit, we saw this scene that was sort of like from the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they hid the Lost Ark amidst all these boxes, because it was the perfect place to hide it, because no one would ever find it there, and it seemed to go onto the horizon. That was your Cook County Assessor's office and 1 year's worth of appeals. So imagine a whole city block from Randolph to Washington, really high ceiling, piled high to the rafters with paper files of appeals, and filed in the order that they were received. So if one appeal comes in from Evanston, that's number one. Another one comes in from Oak Forest, that's number two, and sort of assemble any of the information from these appeals in any systematic way was pretty much impossible. So that, in a way, was kind of a parable for a system that was buried in paper, distrusted by people who lived in Cook County, where the people had sort of learned a behavior that you should appeal no matter what, even if you don't know what your assessment is, and a system that was really lacking in technology and systematic management. And so we've tried to bring that that sort of wraps up a lot of the problems that we confronted. So one of the first things that we did is that, fortunately, we had a 10-month period to plan for taking over the office. We didn't get any help from the previous administration, but we did get help from over 30 assessors' offices around the country. Had a good roadmap for some of the key things that you should do to run a good operation. So we adopted a lot of those methods. The first thing is we brought in really good people, and we'll talk more about that. Second thing we did is we started integrating more technology into our work. So a lot of this technology has helped us to be more nimble as COVID-19 overtook us. So, for example, you couldn't really do online appeals before. You could submit an internet appeal as a consumer, but on the back side of the operation, we had to do it all through paper. Because we implemented the smart file system of online appeals in February, now we're able to do that online. You used to have to do all your exemptions on paper form. We were able to do those online now as well. We had a really embarrassing website. Now we have a website that's much more functional, a lot more information on it. It's more logical and easy to use. We put into place a new call center. We've integrated better technology and data sources into our evaluations. People can do online document requests. So that made us more nimble. It's helping us to become as adept technologically as a lot of our peers in the rest of the country. We still have more work to do, don't get me wrong, but in the year plus that we've been in, that helped us to adapt to the COVID-19 world, and we're really pleased to say we haven't had any cases of COVID-19 on our staff, and we're still able to function, so we're proud of that. Another thing that we came up on, I'll just give you an example, is we had an absurd situation where 1/3 of 1 million senior households had to file a paper appeal certifying that they were still over 65 every year when we came into this administration. It caused incredible hardship. Imagine those 300,000 households, all the different things that go into submitting a paper form to file your exemption, tens of thousands of people forgetting to do that. My dad was one of them in April of 2018 when my mom died, and he's one of the most thrifty people that you'd know, but he didn't get around to it, and tens of thousands of people get caught in that situation. And then also imagine the amount of paper that would go around our office getting lost. Employees would have to open thousands of pieces of mail per day. Imagine what a disaster that would be in the era of COVID-19 with seniors having to come to our office filing these paper forms. So we got passed on the General Assembly automatic renewal of the senior exemption. We worked with House and Senate leadership to get that done. The governor signed it this year. We implemented it early, and seniors now get their senior exemption automatically renewed. That is a huge benefit, quality of life for 1/3 senior households who did not have to come into our office when COVID-19 was taking off. And we're really proud of that. And we have our data operation was strong enough to handle that. I think a third example of a problem that was very well known with our office that we've addressed is complete non-transparency in how the numbers were calculated. Our office was notorious throughout the rest of the United States for being inaccurate, for it not disclosing how it arrived at its numbers, and not showing its work. We really flipped the script on that. We published our whole residential model, all of the lines of code for it, put it up online. We actually showed all the different alterations to the code that are being made by our programmers. And you can see the debates between the programmers on different issues and how we're handling them. And on the commercial side, we showed all of the assumptions that we use going into our evaluations to make ourselves more accountable. You know, sometimes that they're not the most accurate portrayal of our incredibly diverse commercial base, but we think it's better for us to show how we're getting to our numbers so that if we're getting it wrong, we can identify the source of error, and that also makes our system more predictable and accountable, and we can start getting on the trajectory to building trust in our system. You know, more work has to be done, but we are miles away in transparency from where we were before. So those are just some examples. We could talk about other changes that we put into place in terms of ethics, executive order processes. We brought in an auditor, and so on.
I particularly like the example of the senior exemptions because it's a fairly simple thing, but it affects thousands and thousands of people and saves them money. Next question, you've changed traditions. I don't know of any other assessor in Cook County that does not accept campaign contributions from those hundreds and hundreds of property tax attorneys that work with the office. Why did you do that? And that's a lot of money that you're not getting.
Well, this has been a very long-standing issue. It's a giant conflict of interest when the people who practice before your office every day are the people who are financing your campaign. That's just an incredible conflict of interest. It's been well known. People were kind of accepted it, and the bet that we made when we ran for the office is that people would care enough about this and having a better system that it was important enough to other people to bring about change here, so that the system wouldn't do as much damage as it was doing. If you're catering to a small group practicing before the office, the insiders are going to win. It comes at everyone else's expense. And in terms of building trust, to us, that was one of the most logical things that you could do, was not to take contributions from the lawyers and appraisers who practice before your office and sustain a campaign based on larger civic interests that people want to have in having a more transparent, fair, and ethical assessment system. And we were very proud of what we did. We had thousands of people supporting us, and we've done pretty well. We're in a new era of not having fundraisers, so we'll figure out how to do that. But one thing that we've made a commitment in, including an ethics executive order, is not to take contributions from people who practice before the office.
Well, it's a good step for good government, because the last thing you want is wondering if an assessor's office is making a decision about your future, your property taxes. Is it being done because of the money they've contributed, or because the facts show that you should get it?
I think the terrible reputation our office had nationwide and locally, a lot of it had to do with that.
Okay, I'm going to jump right into some of the questions because we got so many. I'm going to start with Joan Esposito, as you know now, who's a star on Progressive Radio. She asked you, Fritz, what changes are you making to your proposal to Springfield for property tax relief?
Sure. So our proposal was to have a data modernization framework be adopted by the state so that we would have a better, more accurate picture of what's going on in properties that earn rental income, larger properties that earn rental income. And we made, the bill passed by bipartisan supermajority out of the Senate last session, and it has, quite a lot of co-sponsors, enough between co-sponsors and people who told us that they'd support us, that they would pass it. But we worked with many different stakeholders to take into account their feedback, to make it more precise, provide more instruction, to make it clear who it applies to, who it doesn't apply to. We lowered fines, we changed the disclosures, we built in privacy protections. That all came at the end of the session. What we did is we rolled that language into a new vehicle this session. Now, this session, we've been told all along, and by the way, the framework of our bill was one of the recommendations in the draft report of the Property Tax Relief Task Force. The session has not really been able to do anything because it's been overtaken by COVID-19. Now, we know that the unfinished business in the General Assembly is property tax reform and relief. And this is a piece of legislation that's ready to go, that's been vetted, that got all that feedback in through over 10 hours of negotiating sessions at the end of last session. And it's one of the few elements of a property tax reform and relief package that doesn't involve terrible trade-offs. A lot of the other things involved in property tax relief in Illinois involve really terrible trade-offs of shifting burdens, of taking dollars here and funding them there, and that's really hard. The data modernization bill is more necessary than ever in a crisis like this, so that we'd have more of a real-time sense of what's happening, because we know that this has been an economic catastrophe for any kind of building that has service businesses occupying it. Think of all the restaurants, think of the beauty parlors, think of all these little businesses that provide rental income, who are not only not able to pay their rent, but any lease commitments that they've made might not be money good. What happens to the value of these properties? If we had a better sense of what was happening in terms of rents being modified, as we would under the data modernization framework, it would put us in a better position to have our assessments be responsive. Because the way we do assessments now is we have to use third-party data, and that's kind of like driving with a foggy rearview mirror, where the data is reflective only of the past and it's incomplete, especially not very complete for small businesses. And in a downturn like this, we would be able to be more accurate and responsive if we had that framework in place. Now we think that we hope that this session, this will be part of the property tax relief work that they do. We know that this will come down the very end in May, and that this is a day-by-day situation.
And just in case people are not up to it, the heart of this is you want in this legislation, you want more data from a certain size commercial groups, particularly, and that data will then provide evidence to make it easier to assess accurately the value of the property.
That's right. So the third-party data that we have, some of it is pretty comprehensive. Like for big downtown buildings, we already have the data, and it's comprehensive. But the further you get out from the center of town, the more you get out into the neighborhoods, the smaller the properties get, the more unique they get, the more they're in neighborhoods, the more they suffer from things like vacancy and non-collection. The older the building is, the more expensive it is to operate. If it's operated by a mom and pop rather than an institution, then the data that we have is largely institutional, and it kind of breaks down, it becomes less relevant and less accurate. And so the data bill is all about getting us better data so that it's more real time and it's more reflective of what's going on, especially for the smaller commercial properties. It's not about burden shifting. It's actually, in a crisis like this, it would help us to be able to more accurately estimate just how bad this is for that small owner of a courtyard apartment building in Austin, or the person who owns that single-story retail business on 79th Street. that is likely, facing catastrophe.
Okay, I'm going to bunch a few questions together. There are roughly maybe 170 people that might be listening. We can't get to all their questions, but let me go a little further into quote tax relief and question about the pandemic. I'm going to throw a few together, and you can. So George Wabeb, I'm sorry, George, asking about the impact of a pandemic on assessments. We kind of touched on that. Bapu Arakapudi asked about if there any relief on taxes because of the virus or virus rebates. David Miller was asking about, will the due date for property taxes be delayed? And several other people have questions around that, about particularly the impact of the pandemic on the property taxes.
Sure. So first of all, the pandemic is kind of a unique economic event. We don't have many precedents for something this big. 1/3 of Americans have lost their job. 1/3 of Americans who were working have lost their job. I'm sorry, 1/7, 1 out of 7. That is just extraordinary. We've never had it happen so suddenly. We know that unemployment is especially going to be concentrated in certain sectors like the service sector. And so we started this year going as we usually do, doing our assessment as of January 1st. And we started sending out assessments in the south suburbs. And then COVID-19 really mushroomed, and it started having the catastrophic effect on people's economic lives that we're all experiencing right now. And we made a call to say, we're not going to send out additional assessments based on January 1st. We're going to try to take into account as best we can what we think the economic impact will be this year on valuations, how the market for property has changed as a result of COVID-19. A lot of states, you can't do this. In this state's property tax code, you can. And we thought that was the right thing to do, that even though we don't have a huge amount of data, we have some data to work with. And we know that doing nothing is definitely the wrong thing to do in a situation like this, that we should try our best to get as accurate as we can for the south suburbs. So for the towns that have already received notices, folks had already started putting in appeals for them. We'll process the appeals, and then we will make a ruling on those with the COVID-19 adjustment for everyone, whether they appealed or not, in those towns that had already received those assessments. For the rest of the south suburbs, we will send out new assessments that take into account the effect of COVID-19. Additionally, for the other parts of Cook County that aren't up for reassessment this year, the city of Chicago and the north suburbs, we're not going to do a full, complete reassessment, but we will be able to do some sort of adjustment for COVID-19 that's broader, and we'll do that, and we'll publish more details about that when we have them. But that is our intent, because again, we think that's the right thing to do for the average person, that an adjustment that we make will be better than doing nothing, and that we always try to think about, we judge how we are serving the folks who live in this county based on how are we serving the average person who doesn't appeal. We knew if we did nothing, some folks who appeal might do better as a result of the circumstances, causing more inequity. And so we said, look, we should try to make an adjustment for the parts of the county that are not up for full reassessment because of COVID-19, because that would serve the average person who's not appealing better. So that's what we are doing on our end for COVID-19. We also, as part of the appeals process, people can make appeals on the basis of vacancy, and as part of that, under that rubric, we will try to also take into account the effect that landlords have had in making adjustments for rent with tenants, and we'll come up with a process for that too. So there are a couple of other questions you asked. So that's the impact on assessment. The key thing for listeners to know here, I know we have a lot of people who are experts on the system here, but some people might not know. Whatever assessments we do this year, only affect taxes in the second half of 2022. So any changes in assessments this year don't impact the taxes that you will have to pay if you're a property owner in July, which is the second half of your tax bill. So that's important to know. We, as the assessor's office, we don't control taxes. We don't control the imposition of taxes, the levying of taxes, or the collection of taxes. The Illinois Property Tax Code sets up the deadline, and the county treasurer sends out your tax bill and collects the taxes, and it's all the taxing bodies that determine the tax that you pay. And our assessments are only used for dividing up that bill that was determined by those taxing bodies equitably amongst all the people who live in that area. That's why we do assessments, but we don't decide the taxes here. So what we've tried to do is, in doing all our work this year, we believe that we will get our assessment work done by December, so that bills can go out on time in the second half of 2021. And I know that for some folks, that is good news. The reason why that this is important is that your state and local governments that we have depend on sales tax revenues and property tax revenues to fund themselves. And they are the front lines for COVID-19. Think of our Cook County hospital system, which is the safety net system for most charitable care in the whole Chicago area. Think of all the public health authorities that have been speaking to you about COVID-19. Think of all the first responders and the fire departments and police that populate the ambulances that are taking. These are all financed by property taxes, especially in the absence of sales tax revenues, which are so hurt by what's happening in the economy. So, and they don't. The other thing is our local governments don't have the ability to engage in deficit financing like our federal government can. And even more, financial markets have been disrupted by COVID-19. So even if they wanted to borrow, there might not be liquidity. So our property tax system gives the stopping power to state and local government to turn COVID-19 around. And so we think we need to be part of that effort in maintaining the functioning of the system. So we don't get the chance to set the deadlines, but we think that local governments are going to want to keep the collections on track because they don't have any other alternative. I think as we talk about property tax relief, this is why we need to focus our conversation on Washington. Because Washington, our federal government, has the unique ability, as distinct from state and local government, to engage in deficit financing. It creates money. It has special ability to tax income, and it does it on a national basis. Only the federal government has the kind of firepower that will be able to provide true tax relief. I think that our state and local governments are going to try to look at ways that deadlines can be extended, that fees can be reduced. But in the end, that's not going to provide real relief because they are going to have to finance themselves to do all the normal things that we expect of our local governments. So when we are all thinking about relief, we should focus the conversation on the federal relief package. So the $2 trillion package, that the CARES Act that was passed at the end of March, is a start, provides $150 billion for state and local government to support their efforts. It doubles Title I support for education, which is really important. The majority of property taxes are for education. And every dollar that comes from the federal government for education is one less dollar that has to be levied on people here in Cook County. And the math of this is really interesting. So in the city of Chicago, they get $300 million from Title I from the federal government currently. In the CARES Act, they doubled Title I. And the CPS's levy is $3 billion. So each doubling of Title I, in principle, can lead to a reduction in the levy coming from the city. And if you think about it, $15 billion compared to a $2 trillion package is peanuts. We should call for more federal backstopping of Title I of education. That will make the biggest bang for Chicagoans, for people in the south suburbs, west suburbs, but also in other parts of the suburbs too. And then much more robust support for state and local government. Governor Pritzker came out with budget projections today that are really dire. And I think it underlines the necessity for the Fair Tax Amendment, which is up for vote in November, which will be necessary so that we don't have to lean on, make cuts, fire people, rely more on property taxes, that we can find other sources. But I think as the conversation on relief has got to be about how do we replace the things that we normally use property taxes for with other sources? And the answer is almost entirely in the hands of decisions being made at the federal government. And we've got to press harder on this. It's also, we know about the massive inequities in the impact of COVID-19 and the disparities that we've known about for a long time economically in the city. And property taxes are an enormous part of the drivers of those disparities. So if you look at Cook County, we have about 130 municipalities in Cook County. The top 20 municipalities in property tax rates are all majority Black communities. And the property taxes they pay are 3 to 5 times the level of the rest of the county. And so think about what that means for a person whose only asset is probably their home, who's just getting a toehold in the middle class. They have to pay 3 to 5 times the rate just for staying in place that anyone else does. That's a massive driver of inequity. And the way we change that is through Title I, through more federal support for education, because that is the dominant driver of property taxes. So anyway, long answer to a very important question. Happy to talk more about it. Just to review, the due date, not determined by us, it's determined by the Illinois Property Tax Code, and the treasurer collects it. True property tax relief, the real action is in federal backstopping of local expenses.
Okay, Fritz, you just answered lots of people's questions.
Okay.
I did read most of the questions, although some come in late. Let's just highlight a couple things you just said. Sure. So people understand, first of all, you're not passing the buck to the federal government. You're pointing out something very clear. They can print money, okay? Yeah. All of us have to have balanced budgets. We don't have those kind of choices. And if people want to look at one of the most successful things is, we went to very serious deficit spending. We had to borrow a ton of money in World War II, just an incredible amount of money. But obviously, when the country came roaring back after that, all of that was regained. So it's a good model for it. A few other things, because I'm glad you explained it. People somehow think you're going to decide property taxes, and so it's important that people understand the assessor, assesses the property, the treasurer sends out the bills, the county clerk, like I was, we ready to figure out how much taxes you're going to pay. But that's based on the levies of all those 130 some taxing bodies. They could be towns. Yeah. Okay. You also focused on how it's so important in terms of, look at the south suburbs you're doing right now. I just want to give an example of that. If you wonder, when Fritz just said how people in many of the south suburbs are paying a much higher rate, okay? Think for a moment. You think of Skokie. Skokie, if you know Skokie at all, they have lots of shopping centers, A lot of property tax money comes in that way. They don't have that in Fort Heights. They don't have that in many of the value of the properties. So the point is, because they don't have that other value, they get hit. Because why? The levy doesn't change. People always ask, well, my property is worth less and I can't even pay for that. So why don't my taxes go down? The governments levy money, and most governments are trying to increase things. Whether it's a poor suburb or rich suburb, you're trying to spend a little more for education, trying to spend a little more for the police, fire, etc. Minimal raises, whatever it may be. So that's why, to circle that all back, that's why it's so important that we understand, frankly, understand how important the November election is.
That's right, and we should all support the members of our congressional delegation in Washington and tell them that, hey, we need you to support, to deliver for us, average folks who pay property taxes in the future stimulus, and it's not even stimulus, it's relief, because the economy has come to a halt. We've never had anything like this in American or world history before in living memory. And the federal government has unique perspective on this. And a reminder why property taxes are so high in Illinois. It's because we're dead last in the United States for supporting our school districts at the state level with support. Dead last, but we're like down there with Mississippi. And about 25% of school district budgets comes from the state. Another 8% or so comes from the federal government, and the rest, it comes from taxing local property. And imagine you're in a community whose property values have all fallen. And that is what's happened to our south suburbs over the last decade. A lot of property values fell 50% there in the wake of the financial crisis and never recovered. And yet they have to keep the lights on at their schools and keep the teachers and first responders in place. So that means when their property value halves, the rate can double, and then they get caught in the trap, because then people in the community have to pay so much more just to stay in place. And if we think back to how damaging the financial crisis was, if you look at a community like Harvey, not only are the rates ruinously high, their homes are not even a net asset for most people in Harvey now. More than half of the people with mortgages in Harvey, their mortgage is bigger than the value of their home. And that's true before COVID-19. And so what kind of relief can you, and how is that fair to a kid who's growing up in Harvey, a family in Harvey that did nothing to cause this themselves? People who live in Harvey are not responsible for creating the situation. So this is where the federal government needs to assert itself. For every dollar that the federal government provides a local school in Harvey, that's one less dollar that needs to come from people in the community, and the rates can start to be more equitable. And so these problems are interlinked. We think of property taxes as a local issue, but they're really linked to a past federal application on education. We should use the opportunity in finding ways for COVID relief to address that problem, because more disparities will persist and get even worse as a result of this crisis if we don't. Also, our state and local government finances are pro-cyclical. When the economy is growing, they're generating more money through sales taxes and property taxes. But when the economy goes down, they're generating less. So how do they pay for what's there? They either have to fire people or borrow or raise property taxes, all of which will be ruinous in this kind of situation. The recovery from the global financial crisis was delayed because the relief package passed in 2009 didn't have enough support for state and local governments. So they were a drag through cuts, through other things as the economy recovered. We don't want to be in that position again. And so we should all be calling on the folks who represent us in Washington to make sure that they're going to bat for us on this key issue here, because that's where the real money is in relief.
Very, very good. Okay. I've got a lot of questions. We'll see if we go through some of them quicker, but a specific one from Rolando Rodriguez. How does the pandemic change the implementation of the updated vacancy rates now being rolled out?
So we
have no idea what that means.
It just the context for people who don't know, a lot of people don't. So we'll just review. Our office in the past has, if people said that my property is vacant or uninhabitable, we would cut the assessment in reflection of that vacancy. Now, as we examine those policies, we think the policies as implemented in the past were excessive, because you could get your assessment reduced on a building by up to 90% if it was vacant. but the market value for a building in that situation would never fall 90% because a potential buyer could reasonably expect to occupy that building and generate more income out of it in the future. So we have a new policy that we are on the verge of releasing that will recognize the reality of a vacancy, but it won't, if you have 90% vacancy, it won't result in a 90% reduction in assessment. It will be a fraction of that. And so we will release that, and the effects of COVID-19 would be under the rubric of that vacancy policy. We are trying to come up with a way under the rubric of the policy so that if landlords are surrendering earning power in their building by abating rent, by providing free rent, by modifying rent to tenants, to have that reflected in our assessment policy as well. We're working on that.
Okay, let me just mention briefly, I think you answered Renuka Sharma's question was about Title I. You discussed some of that. Kathleen Ellett was asking about reducing assessments, the effect on levies and so forth. You kind of covered that. There's just so many questions here.
Sure. We got time.
Let me, Froy Jimenez, okay, asked, we kind of covered, but what are formulas used to assess residential and commercial without taking much time on this one? And can both coexist without hurting the other?
Yes, so our single mission is to estimate the market value of all different kinds of real estate. And the market looks at residential and commercial in different ways. Single family homes are traded very frequently in the market. There are lots of transactions. We can reasonably estimate the value of a single family home if we know some basic attributes about it, its location, when it was built, building quality, the size of the lots, some index of quality, and we can pretty reasonably estimate through a mass model to estimate what the market value of these things is. Now, the key thing is to make sure that we actually have good characteristic information about homes, which we know is a problem because of the accumulation of all those IT problems that I mentioned at the start of this call. That if you can imagine over the decades in Chicago that things were built without building permits, or building permits were filed but they were incomplete, or building permits weren't recorded at our office or passed on to us, or were done inaccurately. Imagine all the accumulation of that over the decades, and I think you can understand the experience that a lot of homeowners have who try to go out and compare how they're assessed with some of their neighbors, and they sometimes see data that's just way out of whack. And so that, if the data is out of whack, that can cause our models to be out of whack. So, but that's the basic approach on residential. We think we've tightened up a lot of the regressivity problems that we had in residential modeling through better modeling. And regressivity means the more modest your home is, there's a tendency to over-assess it the more modest the home gets, and the tendency to under-assess it the more valuable the home is. And that should not be happening. We should be doing a good enough job modeling so that doesn't happen. We think through better use of modeling techniques, and the data shows this, that we are more accurate than before, and that we've reduced regressivity a lot on the residential side. Now on the commercial side, commercial property is so incredibly diverse. That's one of the hardest things about it, and there are fewer transactions in it, and they tend to be valued by the market based on the earning power that they have. If you're looking at a commercial property, the market tends to inquire as to, well, what sort of operating income can this building throw off over time? And then they look at, then there's a multiple of annual operating income that the market will pay. And of course that fluctuates as people have alternatives in the market for different things that also throw off income. And then you throw in something like COVID-19, and maybe leases won't be money good. Maybe rents will have to be lower. Maybe vacancy will come into play. And then the market in general is more risky, and that can cause our commercial market to go haywire. So when we look at commercial properties, we really try to understand each little submarket they're in, and then think about how much income a building can throw off, which depends on its rent and its expenses and its vacancy. And then we try to look at the multiple that the market will pay for the income that building can generate. So you can see how that's a different way of looking at things from how residential works. But that's how the market looks at it, and so we try to put ourselves in the shoes of the market, so we're doing our job right. Because the problem in the assessor's office comes in when we are systematically underestimating or overestimating the value of certain kinds of property. That affects everyone else because our assessments are interlinked in this state. Because as David mentioned, assessments are about dividing up a fixed sum of dollars that have to be paid every year in property taxes in your community. We use assessments to divide them up amongst us. If you can imagine one group is under-assessed in your community, that means everyone else makes up the difference. So it's very important. And so even if you don't own commercial property, you as a homeowner have an interest in making sure that all kinds of commercial property are assessed fairly. And if you're a commercial property owner, you want to make sure that commercial property is being assessed fairly so that you're not paying more than your fair share. So our job, we think, and we think this is what people want, and the way we're supposed to do our job is to estimate all those things as close to the market as possible.
It's pretty complicated.
Yes,
Okay.
it is, unfortunately. I think, one of the biggest surprises to me when I came into this office was how few people actually have understanding of this, and it's not anyone's fault, except for the people who created the system, and I'm sure it was made very hard to understand by design. But part of our job is to make this clear to people that our office is the office about equity. We don't raise taxes, but we are about dividing up that burden amongst us according to market values, and that's our job.
The next question is from Neural E. It's actually a question for me, but I want to deal with it quickly. It's a little different subject. The question is, what is needed to ensure a robust vote by mail everywhere, including other states not so enlightened? Everybody knows what happened in Wisconsin. Everybody knows people put their lives on the line going to vote. I think most people know our wonderful U.S. Supreme Court basically said, no, we're not going to give anybody in Wisconsin more time to vote by mail, even though they knew that thousands and thousands of mails because of the virus had not been mailed out, and thousands of people therefore didn't get to vote. So yes, we need to push as much as we can, both at the federal level, which will be likely unsuccessful, but both federal level and state level, is to make our mail vote as robust as possible. There's a lot of politics involved in mail voting. I think it's Nebraska that if you live in a real small rural town, you can vote by mail, but if you live in a city, you can't. There's all sorts of shenanigans around it. And of course, we've heard some of the president's comments that we can't have voting by mail. Other Republicans think it's fine. But the bottom line is that there's things that we can do, particularly in Illinois, while we have voting by mail. We still need to make sure we get applications out to people as easily as possible. And we need to push other states. And there's actually some progress there. Particularly some of the swing states are realizing they cannot tell people, particularly because we have no idea what the state of the virus will be come October. Dissipate and come roaring back.
And David, if I could just build on that, my dad lives in a senior building down in Hyde Park. He's been a regular voter. His building went into lockdown because of COVID-19. So he applied kind of late in the game to vote by mail, and a ballot didn't get back to him on time. So for folks who voting by mail is the safest way to vote, but make sure you get that application to vote in early so that you don't lose your ability to vote based on the performance of the Postal Service.
Right. Okay, again, we're going to try and move through a few more. I know it's getting close to 8, but Meg White asks, how can real estate agents prepare their clients for these changes? What should they know, do, say in their communications with property owners? A little general, and you've covered some of it, but she's asking, what should they know?
Sure. Well, so we are in the south suburbs. We're taking into account COVID-19, and part of our effort to take into account of what's going on with COVID-19 is talking to agents. Agents actually have probably the best feel for what's going on in the market. I know people in Oak Park who've been buying and selling during COVID-19. I know other people in Hyde Park, the neighborhood that I grew up in the same position. And brokers have a good sense of some of the dynamics going on now. I think brokers could tell you that the market is still trying to find a level. There's still price discovery happening. Being a broker is all about helping that price discovery process go along. I think that one of the things that we can look to is there are publicly traded real estate investment trusts that reflect different kinds of real estate, and there are single-family home real estate investment trusts that have fallen between 5 and 10% since January 1st. And that's sort of one way of seeing, here's what the actual market impact is in capital markets, their estimate of the value of properties. We've been talking to government, to economists in academia and in our financial regulatory system, because they have to think about this too, because they regulate the banking system, tell banks how much they have to reserve for changes in real estate prices. Talking to people, employment is a big driver of housing prices. We've never had this much unemployment happen so fast. So we're kind of on uncertain ground. Now, if we go back and look at the financial crisis before, in no year did housing prices change more than, in a larger area, by more than 15% in 1 year. So we think that's kind of like a lower bound for how much it can change in a year. Those are some data points that we've teased out. I mean, we're still trying to figure out what it will mean in each community, but in our assessment methodology, we're looking really closely at which communities have the most people who are employed in the service industry. We think the more people who are employed in the service industry, the bigger the impact will be, because it affects their ability to stay current on their mortgage and to feel good about buying. I think brokers should know that the financing side of our system is still working pretty well. There's great support coming from Fannie and Freddie. They're providing forbearance on mortgages for up to a year if people aren't evicted. The same thing goes for landlords, that they can get 3 to 12 months of forbearance if they agree not to evict. They don't have to pay on their mortgage during that period. So I think the financial system is getting a lot of support in helping to assist buying power. I'm worried about consumers. Let's say we get the all clear to go back to work this summer. Are consumers going to be as ready to spend as they were before? Are businesses going to be as ready to invest and hire people back as they were before? Is the banking system going to be as eager to lend as they were before? I think there's going to be some caution in all of those parts, which will have a slight downward pressure on things. So these are some of the things that we talk about on our team. Our chief valuation officer is the perfect person to be captaining this right now. His name's Don Meyer. He ran lending for Byline Bank, which is a major local bank here. He has worked in the lending industry through many different cycles since the 70s. And that experience in doing bank workouts and things like that has been extremely valuable in helping us think this through. But I think the good news for brokers is that people still want housing. The difference between where we are now and the 2008 financial crisis is in the 2008 financial crisis, there'd been this huge housing bubble. And then we had this disruption to the financial system that caused very dramatic declines in housing values. We don't think that will happen again because we've not been in a bubble. As many people in the south suburbs know, their housing values never recovered since the financial crisis, so it will be hard to go down another 50% or something like that. I think we can look to different data. I think brokers should be talking to their colleagues, the professional association, the realtors, to get a sense for where things are. The market makers are actually in possession of some of the best data right now when it comes to homes. When it comes to how that affects the tax picture, there are a couple things that are sadly unknown. We know in our assessments, we think we can get a pretty good handle on estimating the effect in the South Triad. We'll make some adjustment for Chicago and the North suburbs. Chicago is due to be reassessed next year. Any assessment work we do this year only affects taxes the following year. Brokers should know that some of the unknowns for the tax picture are what will be happening to the budgets for the local school districts and municipalities. And a lot of that depends on federal aid. A lot of that depends on how long this crisis goes on. Because if our cities are not getting sales tax revenues for the rest of the year, and the state is not getting income taxes to backstop local governments the way they usually do, there's going to be a world of hurt on the tax picture, I'm sorry to say, but that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried that our local governments are going to be faced with some pretty terrible choices in the next year. And I think brokers should just be upfront with people about that. People want to get in a home, will get into a home, but be upfront about them about the financial picture for local governments.
Fritz, it's already 8 o'clock. Can you hang on a little longer?
Sure, I'm good.
Okay, there's so many questions. Like I say, we won't get to all of them. Mike Pensack asked, why are condos so underassessed in comparison with single-family houses? Is there a short answer to that one?
I'm reluctant to make a broad sweeping generalization about that. I think that as we look at the data that we have on condos, the way we value condos in the state is kind of weird. There's a part of the Illinois property tax code tells us how we're to value condos, that we don't know all of the details of the interiors of condos, and the way we value them is we value the whole building, and then each condo within the association, they have a percentage ownership in it, and that's what we use to determine their percentage of the total value of the building. Now, a lot of times the percentages that are written into the condo agreement don't reflect the market's attribution of value. Many condo owners have told us that the lower floors subsidize the higher floors, that the higher floors get a premium in the market that's not reflected in their percentage share of the attributed value of the condo. So that could be one of the things that leads to a big difference. Our data science team has worked really hard on improving our condo metrics. We know if we're doing a good job on condos, if condos are transacting the market, we've actually accurately estimated how they're valued. We think we got a lot better on that last year. We think we'll be better this year. We'll be better in Chicago next year. I think the other thing we have to remember about the way homes are valued is some homes can be overassessed because we haven't had good enough data about them. There have been some other modeling practices that were out there before we came into our office. We think that they didn't take into account foreclosures to a significant enough extent. So any neighborhood that had lots of foreclosures, we don't think that they were accurately enough taking account of that fact. So there are a lot of things. It's always dangerous to generalize about things because we can always find counter examples. But just to answer your question, that's kind of how I'd answer it.
Okay, here's a specific one from an RJ Gravel. Given the recent announcement that the assessor's office will be reassessing all of Cook County, will the assessor consider evidence submitted jointly by property owners and school districts as part of their new valuation process?
Well, first of all, we always consider that evidence. We love getting submissions from interested parties, especially school districts, who oftentimes have the resources to hire appraisers who don't have a financial interest in underestimating the value of the property. So we always welcome that. Just to be clear, we're doing a full reassessment of the south suburbs. We'll make a COVID-19 adjustment to values in the city of Chicago and the north suburbs, but it won't be a full reassessment. We just don't have the resources to do a full reassessment. But people have a right to appeal their assessment, and we will take into account the evidence they give us. We want to do a better job this year of making sure that we're not dismissing evidence just because there was some small element of the appeal that was not done properly or missing. Substantial compliance, is what we want people to give us. We don't want to be dismissing information for really totally minor bureaucratic reasons. So we think if there was one thing that we didn't do as well last year is that we had some appeals where we were rejecting them for very minor reasons. And we've tried to address that through new rules this year and new instructions to our analysts.
Okay. Charlene Andreas asked, what is the assessor's office doing to address the assessment process for affordable housing? In particular, scattered site housing that is currently classified as 211. It simply does not pencil out, it simply does not pencil out to assess these properties at the same level as the luxury condos, considering the regulatory restrictions on these properties, since there are limits on the rent that can be charged.
That's right. So when we came in, we found a lot of affordable housing parcels which were classified under the 900 class had lost their classification, their exemption, and we worked really hard to get a lot of those ones that benefited from being carded class 9 because we knew about them back into their classification. Second of all, we want to be assessing affordable housing, multifamily buildings, to treat ones that have limited the rent that they charge, to treat them differently from ones that are charging market rent. Because as you mentioned, as the questioner mentioned, affordable housing buildings sometimes are making legal undertakings that limit the rent that they can charge. We want to take that into that modification, that limitation into account in our valuations and treat like buildings in like ways. So we've tried to do this, first of all, by getting comprehensive data from government bodies like the from IDA, using FHA, Federal Housing Administration information, to help us identify those buildings that have affordable housing. There are lots of different affordable housing programs, so we highly, highly, highly encourage anyone who has an affordable housing building to use our real property income and expense form. Every property owner in the south suburbs received a form this summer where they can voluntarily submit this information to us before we've started assessing them. Then that makes sure that we will be putting that property, if it's an affordable housing property, into a separate bucket and assessing it in that way. And we can take into account that information before the appeals process has started. We don't want people to have to pay all the costs of the appeals process to get the outcome they really should have gotten from us at the beginning. The real property income and expense form and the commercial data portal that we created for it this year gives everyone that opportunity to submit the data to us before it started. And with that, we think that will also help to get our assessments right on affordable housing buildings. So please, affordable housing business owners, submit that real property income expense form, the RPI form, when you can.
And we'll do one
Yeah.
more. One last question.
Yeah, one last question, or like let's go back, because so many people asked about schools, which you've talked a lot about. Let's just kind of end with back to the stimulus. In other words, I want people to understand governments are spending an enormous amount of money. There's money coming from the feds. Some of it will go to the states, some will go to the public schools, a variety of things. But at this point, it's not going to be anywhere near enough. Okay, so everything is up in the air. And back to what Fritz said earlier, where we need our Congress to understand the big cities and others need help. And we can't let some of this money, as happened in the past, go to those who don't need it. So let me just ask you, Fritz, obviously you've got a great command of lots more than just assessments. Any closing comments?
Sure. Real big picture, there's $15 billion of property taxes that's collected in Cook County as a whole. About 2/3 of that is for schools. And that amount has to be collected no matter how we do our assessments. Our assessments decide how we divide up that $15 billion amongst the different residents of different communities. The thing with schools is that anyone who lives in that school district has to pay the freight for that school district. And so if the communities that have lots of real estate value in them are in a better position to defray the cost of education than the ones that don't have much real estate value left in them. They can't put off their education costs to other people in the county. And that's where the disparities come from in our system. Because if the state's not providing them support, the federal government's not providing them support, then communities are on their own for funding schools. And if you don't have real estate value there, then you're left with paying really high rates. And that's how we get to the massive disparities that we have today. So how do we get out of that? That is why federal support is so, especially since we know the state does not have the financial capacity to boost it. It may have some. If the fair tax amendment is passed in November, and everyone on this call should be encouraging their friends and families to support that amendment in November, because taxing through income taxes taxes activity much more broadly, and can only focus on really wealthy people who are earning high incomes, rather than just taxing people for being in their houses, regardless of whether they're employed or not. Just think about how crazy our system is if 1 out of 7 people becomes unemployed, but the property tax system doesn't care about that. The income tax system is more flexible and captures a wider range of activities. When we put so much weight on real estate for funding our school system, it just generates terrific unfairness in terms of disparities in rates. It turbocharges segregation, and it hurts the businesses that make our communities interesting places to live in. So the way we get out of that trap is we get more federal support for education, and this is a fundamental thing that should be happening. This was part of the civil rights movement. A. Philip Randolph at the Civil Rights March talked about this. We made some progress on this when the Civil Rights Act was passed. But the federal government really hasn't done anything for 50 years to move the needle since then on federal support for education, and it's long since time for that to happen. And again, each doubling of Title I, each $15 billion that the federal government can add to Title I can translate into a 10% decline in the property tax levy in Chicago, and even bigger decline in some western and south suburbs that suffer from high rates. So that's where the really big bucks are. That's where the biggest difference can make on relief. It also has the happy benefit of reducing disparities. So we should really be focusing our effort and attention on this. No part of the country has more riding on this than Cook County, where property tax rates are high because outside support for our schools is so low. So we should get the best bang for our buck that we can. You know, Illinois is one of only a handful of states that pays more into the federal coffers than we get back. We should start getting back more of our dollars through Title I. By the way, in the income tax code, we should bring back the state and local income tax deduction too. That would be another way to keep more dollars in people's pockets and get more bang for our buck here in Illinois. So yeah, $15 billion might sound a lot, but this was a $2 trillion package. They gave $50 billion to the airline industry alone, when the airline industry bought back $40 billion worth of stock in the last 5 years. $15 billion is not much. We should be focusing more on that federal support, because that's where we can really get, we can start to get levies going in reverse if we take advantage of this time.
Okay, Fritz, on behalf of Good Government Illinois, I want to thank you for your time. And once again, at least to me, you've demonstrated incredible knowledge, very wide-ranging knowledge of what's going on. It makes me very happy that you were elected to the position.
Well, thanks, David. It makes me very happy that we still have more than 50 people on the call here right now with us. Thanks, everyone, for your time, for spending the evening with us. We'll give feedback to Good Government Illinois. We'll do more of these things if there's more call for it.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you to County Assessor Fritz Kaegi for his time this evening, and thanks to all of you for joining us for our first virtual town hall. You'll be receiving a survey shortly in your email, probably tomorrow morning, where we'd like to get some feedback. We want to find out how you enjoyed this event and also find out who you want to hear from in the future. And you can also follow us on our Facebook at, the handle there is Good Government Illinois, and our Twitter account is at GoodGovIL. And you can help us produce events like this one by contributing to Good Government Illinois, and you can do that on our website at goodgovernmentillinois.com. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and everybody have a great evening.
Hey, thanks, everybody. Appreciate you.
Stay safe.
Take care out there.
Okay.